Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here with us for SCMP Conversations Global Tech. Our first panel discussion is online education here to stay. We'll see our panelists discuss the latest education technology trends and where investment is heading in the EdTech space. Before I introduce our panelists, we'd like to give a thank you to our gold sponsor for this webinar, InvestHK. Joining today's panel from InvestHK, we have Herman C., who is their head of business and professional services based in Hong Kong, Will Fan, who is the co-founder and CEO of New Campus based in Singapore, Amir Nathu, who is the co-founder and CEO of OutSchool based in the United States, and David Tate, who is the CEO of Mandarin Matrix based in Hong Kong. Moderating this discussion will be SCMP's technology editor, John Artman. Before I pass things over to John, I want to make our audience aware that we encourage you to submit questions to our panelists. You can do so by using the Q&A chat box via the WebEx platform. We'll be reserving some time at the end of the discussion for your questions, so be sure to get your question in as early as possible for a better chance to get your question over to our speakers. Without further ado, I will pass things over to John to dive into the discussion.
Great. Thanks so much, Clark. It's a real pleasure to be able to moderate another SCMP event online. So before we get into the meat of the conversation, looking at online education, let's just have each of the panelists briefly give an introduction of kind of who you are, what your company does, and I think also a little bit about your journey into the EdTech space. So Amir, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thanks, John. Pleasure to be talking to you on this topic. So my name is Amir Nathu. I'm co-founder and CEO of OutSchool. And OutSchool is the largest marketplace of live online classes for kids in the US. I'm calling you from San Francisco today. The nature of our marketplace is that classes are in small groups over video chats, so typically 3 to 8 students and a teacher, with the students and the teacher joining from all around the country, or in fact around the world. And with our marketplace-based model, teachers are free to teach the classes that they've always wanted to teach and really match the learning to kids' interests. So as well as core subjects, they come up with really creative topics like learning architecture through Minecraft, or a vet teaching about cat anatomy, or engineering taught through Lego, which is really inspiring and engaging for the kids. And as you might imagine, this format of learning has grown tremendously through COVID, and I'm sure we'll get into that in the discussion. In terms of my own journey into EdTech, well, both my parents were teachers, and so that was very influential on me. And I've been in software and technology my whole career, and one thing I've reflected on is both what I observe of my parents' work, but also the fact that although I had a fantastic standard education in the UK, so much of the learning that I have had that I use today in my job has come from out of school learning experiences, so things outside the core curriculum. And that was really inspiration for founding OutSchool, the realization that not only can we use technology to enable different modes of learning, but really what learning needs to be in the 21st century. And with parents of young kids like me, having grown up through the internet, have different expectations about how learning should happen. And that's, I think, going to cause widespread change even after COVID. So that's me. Thanks very much. Very excited to be here talking to you all.
Great. Thanks so much, Amir. I can definitely speak personally to that. I have an 8-year-old son, and I think that he's, while we've been here in Hong Kong and out of school, or at least doing classes online, I think he's probably learned more from watching Dr. Binox on YouTube than he has actually from the classes, which I think says a lot about both formats. Anyway, David, over to you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm David Tate. I'm based here in Hong Kong, and I'm the founder and CEO of Mandarin Matrix. We're in the business of helping children globally learn Mandarin. And the background to this really is that we were brought in about 8 years ago by one of the international school groups here in Hong Kong, who had introduced Mandarin on a daily basis and realized that, unlike with many other subjects, Mandarin was very much under-supported with materials. So the publishing background, which is already doing work in Chinese for other institutions, we dived into the education space, what transpired rather bravely, because we didn't know exactly the extent of the issue that we were going to become suddenly upfront with. We now have a platform that's teaching about 85,000 children every day Mandarin globally, and we've had an extraordinary sort of year in the last, it's more than a year, but we'll focus on the last 18 months, where we've sort of seen 280% growth in user numbers and a burgeoning need for more and more kids to learn Chinese. Being in modern foreign languages, we get a particularly detailed lens on only one aspect, however, of ed tech. Mandarin education space, we're very focused only in one area, whereas you have other people on this panel who have a far wider breadth of knowledge in particular areas. But by focusing down sort of in one area, I think we can bring something to the table. And we're global. So we've had a huge expansion in the US and now in Europe. And whilst we thought we would be kind of in the B2C space, we've actually discovered that we're into the B2G space. So I have some observations as to how one interacts with government rather than just sort of with the end consumer, who ultimately is the child. But my own background, I spent some time in the UK, but I've been in Asia now for 28 years, originally brought up in Japan. I have a 16-year-old and an 18-year-old, and we're kind of in the space of seeing how they've been getting through their online education space. So practitioner as well as an advocate. Okay.
Great. Thanks so much, David. So Herman, let's go to you. So I know that you're not necessarily in specifically in the ed tech space, but certainly, you know, Invest HK this is a space that you guys definitely pay attention to. So give us an introduction of who you are and what Invest Hong Kong is and kind of your interest in ed tech.
Sure. Okay. Invest Hong Kong is a government department responsible for promoting Hong Kong to overseas investors, and education is a sector that my team cover. In the past year, during the COVID period, we actually have seen a lot of education technologies would like to come to Hong Kong and set up their operation here with a target to expand their business in China and the rest of Asia. So I'm honored to be in this panel today and to talk about some advantages of setting their operation in Hong Kong. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Herman. All right. Will, over to you.
Thanks, John. And hi, everyone on the panel and everyone listening today. I'm Will, co-founder and CEO at New Campus. So we're a modern business school in Asia. We're looking to upskill leaders and people in business, or people who want to be in business, for 1% the cost of an MBA. We essentially provide live learning leadership programs for middle managers, senior managers, really focusing on the SMB space. Prior to that, I was building a university platform where we sold remote internship programs to over 40 universities around the world in Asia, Middle East, Australia, the US. My background, I went down a different path. I was in corporate consulting, but personally, I was priced out of an MBA, which is how I forayed into building, platform in the education space, and then ultimately launching our own alternative business school. So, I echo with what Amir and David were saying. Last year was an incredible spotlight for the education space, particularly around people working remotely, universities looking for alternative learning models, but also the technology and infrastructure changing drastically. So very excited to talk a lot about sort of the next version of online education and, where the university and the alternative business school space is moving towards.
Great. Thanks so much, Will. So that actually segues really, really nicely into, I think, the first kind of big topic of discussion. And so, Will, why don't we start with you? And then I think we can just kind of aim for an open discussion on this. So, Will, you mentioned, COVID-19 obviously has had a pretty big impact on educational technology and online education. But at the same time, just because it's been good for the industry doesn't mean it's necessarily been good for every specific company. There's going to be companies that get it right. There's going to be companies that get it wrong. And then also, we're kind of moving, hopefully, into kind of a post-pandemic
situation with vaccines being rolled out across the world. So yeah, Will, I mean, so talk a little bit more about how COVID-19 has maybe helped your business, and also looking forward a little bit into how you guys are planning on dealing with maybe a little bit less demand, perhaps, or if there is less demand you guys expect for online education.
Yeah, and great question. I think the first and foremost benefit of COVID for the education space is there's just a lot more interest in what we do. So if you dial back to 2018, 2019, education and healthcare were one of the slowest industries. And so investment, partnerships, just general interest from consumers wasn't as fast paced as, say, your fintechs or your blockchain. So this year and last year, what we did see is a lot more focus from global investors interested in taking a look at Asia and taking a look at arbitraging education concepts. And on top of that, it allowed us to really accelerate the network and the ecosystem that we were building as entrepreneurs. For our actual business itself, we actually operate in the remote first live learning space. So our traditional incumbents would be a university or a local training consultant. And what you're seeing as one of their biggest challenges right now is moving their content online. There's a difference between building an online native product versus taking an offline product online. And I have seen a lot of New York business opportunities from these traditional players coming to work with us or coming to ask for support in terms of taking their technology, their training, their upskilling through our pedagogies and through our ways of delivering. I think eventually, obviously, there's going to be a COVID vaccine that comes out, but it's quite unpredictable, especially different cities, different countries are going to be opening up their travel restrictions. So I don't see an immediate switch over just yet. We see this as a very good 12 to 18 month window where online practitioners, online learning platforms can really, target and capture their niche, but also capture a market that they wouldn't otherwise have been able to crack.
Yeah, Amir, what about you guys? Can you talk a little bit about how COVID-19 has affected your business and kind of how you're looking at the post-pandemic environment?
Absolutely. COVID's had a dramatic effect on our business, given the format of learning and the flexibility of a marketplace. I was reflecting basically 1 year ago, almost to the day, was when there were mass school closures announced in the US, and I know that happened in other countries before, and we saw an overnight spike in demand and a ramp up towards that as parents really struggled with what do you do when schools were shut. And the Center for Disease Control in the US put out this announcement a few weeks before that saying, hey, we might have to shut schools and move to what they called internet-based teleschooling. And I looked at that and said, internet-based teleschooling. Oh, what they mean is what we call live online classes, that is live interactive experiences over the internet. And so we've seen our business grow 15x in the past year and have 10x the number of teachers teaching through the site. So there's just been an incredible growth in demand. And my co-founder was the first engineer at Airbnb, and I was at Square when that fintech company grew very rapidly, and we've never seen anything like it, even in fast growth startup world. So it's been incredible, and we're really grateful to help a lot of families during this time, because that's what's really driving the demand. People no longer having their default mode of education and needing to look for alternatives. And when the default is gone, that makes people more inclined to innovate and look at future-oriented solutions. What we're seeing more broadly in the US, though, is that demand hasn't been equal. I know of other edtech companies that had to pivot hard because if they were serving the mainstream school system and selling into schools, and the solution wasn't directly addressing online learning, basically demand went through the floor because administrators were focused elsewhere. And so it's primarily been consumer education products that have benefited in the US, and also consumer education products that have benefited from more B2B interest as companies look to adopt consumer-oriented solutions. One thing I'll say is, about the world post-COVID is we expect a correction. We can't expect the same degree of intensity of demand once in-person alternatives become available. But I think there's going to be a lot of aspects of what consumers and organizations have learned during COVID that are going to last. One is I now no longer have to explain what live online is. The US was behind China and other parts of the world on this, in that live online wasn't as adopted in the US pre-COVID, and people would ask, well, how are you different from Khan Academy or Udemy or sites that have pre-packaged content? Now everyone understands the difference between interactive, live online, and the various modes of it, like webinars, broadcast approaches, one-on-one, small groups. They understand the difference. So that gives us a lot of confidence in our business going forward, because it's supported by that much greater understanding in the consumer base of what we offer.
Great, thanks so much, Amir. Yeah, so I've been in China for about almost 13 years now, and it's always interesting whenever I go back home, which, to be honest, isn't that often. And the difference between adoption of some of the latest kind of mobile internet technologies is quite stark. But it's also, I think it's important to recognize that there's a big difference in the market, right? Whereas, so in China, EdTech has been around for a long time, but it's not like this kind of fancy, really kind of high-tech implementation. It's very, very straightforward, just taking, the offline lecture model and just moving that into a video stream, pretty much, right? But the thing is, of course, is that it addresses a real market need. There's a market need and demand for more teachers, for more education, in order for parents to help their children succeed later in life. Whereas the demand, I think that in the US at least, a lot of that demand was already being met offline, right? If you wanted to find a tutor for your child, well, you go and do that offline, right? And so I think it's really interesting how in some ways, across the board internationally, but definitely in the US, you can see that the coronavirus has really pushed the entire country online, kicking and screaming, and perhaps to a certain degree. But yeah, anyway, so David, you guys really kind of focus on a very specific kind of niche type of education. So have you guys seen an uptick in interest because of the coronavirus?
Yeah, we basically saw a huge uptick as soon as the schools started to shut, because Chinese, prior to that point, really hadn't been particularly well aligned with technological delivery. And Chinese teachers were very, very uncomfortable with the thought of anything tech getting involved in teaching the language. And please bear in mind, I'm talking about Mandarin as a second language, which is why I'm looking outward from Hong Kong rather than inward towards China here. I think the Chinese managed to teach themselves very good Chinese. But what we're in the business of doing is basically going out to a whole number of other countries. And there, when the COVID pandemic hit, you had entire school systems which were just not ready in any way to cope with trying to continue what is a very difficult language to learn, where the children have to keep very focused and have to keep on a steady rate of learning. And if you suddenly switch that off because you don't have access to your teacher anymore or to materials, you're going to have a problem. Now, we were lucky in that we'd actually been working quite closely with some US districts and states to have the online component built, and it was actually sort of really launched around 2017 and 2018. And we already had, I think, 13,000 kids in the state of Utah online for 3 hours every day learning Mandarin. So we had a strong foundation to build from. But we've since then learned that there's a global need for this. And it isn't something which is just going to be stuck in the time of COVID. The chances are that there's a growing need for kids to learn Mandarin globally anyway. And you have political drivers, including the fact that the Confucius Institutes globally have been shut down. And so there's now a vacuum. And we happen to be in a position where we have a tech solution which to a certain extent can step in and support filling that vacuum. That doesn't mean we're trying to do what the Confucius Institutes did. We're very much in the K-12 space, but we have shown, well, we've been seeing very, very high growth, and we've shown actually that the kids who are doing this online are actually managing to maintain the sort of the proficiency standards we would have hoped that they would have got if they had access to a live teacher. So I'm not saying it's better, but our data that we're gathering at the moment says that it's at least as good as for the moment. And hopefully in the future, we'll have a nice hybrid system where we can get more children learning using online who wouldn't otherwise be able to learn a more difficult subject such as Mandarin.
Great. Thanks so much, David. So, I mean, kind of staying on that for a moment, you're talking about the type of student. David, do you find that there's a certain type of student that benefits the most from, kind of online, let's say Mandarin learning versus maybe something that's more, offline, kind of face-to-face?
Well, I mean, language learning generally has very much involved working with a teacher, because when it comes to oral language, it's quite difficult to use tech as a sort of a panacea for what a live human being would be doing otherwise. And so that's the first consideration. So where has tech stepped in to sort of bridge that otherwise insurmountable problem? But when it comes to the actual type of children in the K-12 space, I would say it's actually pretty universal, and we've got a very strong focus on the equity in education anyway. I mean, we're delivering something at less than $1 a week for a user. So we don't think that this is something which kids in New York City or in London or in Sydney should actually be particularly benefiting from. We think it's as much about children in Jakarta or in Dhaka, and we now have people in the Middle East wanting to learn Mandarin. And I think if you have a subject which, like Mandarin, has a universal sort of potential to grow, which is driven by other economic factors which are outside straight education, if you can align the tech correctly, you actually do have the opportunity to make a lot of difference to a lot of children in a lot of different spaces. So I think that's where we stand on it. However, I would stress the fact that we are already in the artificial intelligence space. We're looking at natural language processing and things. But one thing which is often forgotten here in sort of the buzz about ed tech is what I'd call not the AI, which is the artificial intelligence, but the RI, which is the real intelligence, which are the teachers. So anything we do still has to be totally integrated into what real teachers are doing, because ultimately that is what's going to deliver the best results. Even though we can look at data which will show that you're getting similar results, I would still say with modern foreign languages, you need to have the human interaction.
Yeah, that's David. That's great. And so, Amir, kind of a similar question, but kind of going off of what David mentioned. I mean, so so again, I mean, do you find that certain students benefit versus online versus offline? But then also, how do you track that progress, and how do you kind of prove to parents or customers that you're providing tangible results for their child?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, David brought up this idea of hybrids online and in person. And, post-pandemic, really that's how I see the future of education. And not just kind of on a systemic level that there's going to be, online services and there's going to be in-person services, but on an individual child level, I think, almost all children can benefit from a combination of in-person and online resources to some degree, and the exact mix really depends on the child and their needs and their interests. And the reason I think that all kids could benefit from the combination is that there's this reality that not every type of teaching or subject can be provisioned locally. In denser areas, you have a denser amount of supply of skills of teachers and different options for kids, and that's great. But even in the most denser supply, there's always some interest or need that your child is going to have that is not easy to find local skills. And so for that reason, I believe almost every child can benefit from the combination. What we find is that interest-based learning is very suited to online, because when you are looking to follow kids' interests, you diverge in terms of the subjects that they want. Whereas if you're focused on core academics, then it's usually easier to find local skills of teachers who are very familiar with. There's a standard set of subjects, and they're taught to a lot of kids. There's usually teaching available. So that's why interest-based learning, I think, is more suitable to online. Also, kids who are outliers have special needs in some ways, and that could be learning differences It could be that they're gifted and very advanced in certain areas. It could be kids who, for cultural or social reasons, don't have access to communities of kids like them. And so there's also a social component which can sometimes be missing in person and which online learning can satisfy. It gets tough though, because in terms of measuring impact, when you think about appealing to kids' interests and diverging in terms of the subjects that they learn, you can't rely so much on standardized metrics and standardized testing. So we're very focused on measuring what we call love of learning and saying, on an individual subject basis, it's very hard for us as a platform to check mastery. That's something the individual teacher can do because they're expert in the subject. But as a platform, our goal is to make sure that kids come out of class more inspired than when they come in. And that's the main goal of the type of learning that we propose.
Great, thanks so much. And so Will, I imagine that a lot of your customers, they are coming to you out of interest, not necessarily out of mandated curricular need. And so do you find that it's a bit easier, perhaps, in a sense, to sell to adults than it is to children for these or parents for these types of products? And also a similar question, do you find that there's a certain kind of profile that fits your platform better than perhaps others?
Yeah, I think generically speaking, online education has been accessible, has been made accessible to those who wouldn't otherwise have had access over time. So nowadays you could have a kid or a student from Indonesia access Harvard courses virtually. But I kind of see this as sort of, we're going to this new wave of education platforms, 3.0. The first wave would have been your LMS platforms. The second is your online content providers, your Coursera's, your Udacity's, your Udemy's. But one of the challenges with these content platforms that we've seen is there's just too much content. And you're essentially, seeing that the results also show with, less than 10% completion, less than 15% engagement. And so with, players like myself, like Amir, like David, we're part of this new generation of live learning platforms, which focus on the efficacy of learning and the learning experience itself. And this is quite important because, for example, if MOOCs was the answer, you wouldn't see universities anymore. If MOOCs was the answer, you wouldn't see, corporate trainers anymore. They'd all disappear. And so what we predominantly focus on is that social element, what happens between classes, having good teachers. And, I echo Kathleen's question around, it's not just about going through, the content itself, but how can you, meet like-minded learners? And so one thing that we've seen and we're very proud of is that 80% of our learners are women, 60% of our instructors are women, and 90% of our businesses that send their employees are outside of your traditional business and consulting companies. And so we see this really big opportunity to provide that, diversity, equity, and inclusion angle, whether it's through price points, through targeting and supporting underserved learners in the region, but more importantly, creating that network so it's accessible for anyone to meet people outside of who they know and what they're trying to learn. In terms of making it easier to sell, I think every edtech company is going to have that challenge. For us, the biggest challenges, I think 2 years ago, was really preaching why it's important to continuously learn for the rest of your life. And then over time, with COVID hitting, what we saw was, our learners and our people that previously didn't use our platform start to question, do you really need to have a 4-year university degree anymore? And so the way that we've kind of built out our model is extrapolating, what does a 4-year degree look like over the next 40 years in terms of price points, in terms of the learning experience, in terms of how often should someone be engaging with New Campus itself. So I do think that there's a very big opportunity to really reshape what learning is, but also apply it in the way that people are working. So one example would be, we're starting to see a lot of your major tech players like your Salesforces, your Googles, your Facebooks, allow employers to be working completely online and completely remotely. So what does that look like when it trickles down to education institutions that are trying to, shape the way that they build our curriculum and how their students learn?
Right. Yeah. I mean, so I'm 36, born in 1984. So maybe I'm a millennial, maybe I'm not, depending on your definition. But I think that, like I said, I mean, I have an 8-year-old son and a 14-year-old daughter, and I do think that kind of thinking about the future of education and whether or not university makes sense for them is a big question in my mind. And I kind of wish I had that option when I was a bit younger, or at least had some kind of thinking around it, because when I graduated high school, it was just very clear, you go to university or you work at McDonald's or something. It was kind of the big message, and it's very clear that all that is changing. And of course, it's not just platforms like you guys, but just the entire content space online is growing rapidly. And with monetization tools, like Square, like Stripe, PayPal, WeChat, Alipay, etc., it's become much easier for just individuals to put up a website, create a course, sell that course, and create a livelihood out of that. So it's all very, very exciting and very interesting. But Herman, I wanted to kind of switch gears for a second and talk a little bit about the investment side of everything. Amir mentioned earlier that investment and growth has been quite phenomenal for online education over in the past 12 to 18 months. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about kind of what you're seeing when it comes to investment and the interest of investors in online education.
Absolutely. I think in terms of the investment side, we have seen a lot of investor following the guideline of ESG. So in particular, during the COVID-19 period, a lot of investors are turning to the ESG investment. And one particular sector that we have seen from the investor side is the uprising of family office. A lot of these family offices, it's very different from the traditional VC or private equity investor. They have a mandate of doing philanthropy and ESG impact investment. Like the older generation in the old days, they might just donate some money and build a physical school. But for the newer generation, they think that investment into education technology companies is a new way to go, because it's not only the new trend of investment, but the impact is actually bigger, because an education technology can reach out to a lot more people than a physical school. So we're actually seeing a lot of family office showing interest to invest in education technology companies, definitely for this from this side of the world. And we are actually talking to few overseas education technologies companies who are interested to come to Hong Kong to set up R&D facilities and administrative office, and they would like to seek local partners that would help them to share the responsibility of developing business from this part of the world, because they are all based in overseas, but they are definitely seeing the growth potential in this part of the world. So that's why they want to look for the strategic partners in this part of the world. And then after that, they would go into China and the rest of Asia. So this is the trend that I've been seeing in the past 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, actually, Herman, I was actually gonna ask, I think a similar question. So maybe you can just expand on that a little bit.
Sure.
So why Hong Kong? I mean, is it? You mentioned R&D, but is part of your pitch also, does that include market access, or is that like for Hong Kong, or is it more about, as you mentioned before, kind of exploring using Hong Kong as a jumping off point into mainland China or Southeast Asia?
Absolutely, it's part of my pitch. I was emphasize that Hong Kong government has been putting a lot of effort to make Hong Kong into an innovation and technology hub on top of a international financial center. I think that people will be aware that Hong Kong government has set up an innovation and technology fund, and the latest figure shows that already 22 billion Hong Kong dollars have been dispersed to help different type of technology companies. And in the latest budget, that it was announced that another 9.5 billion Hong Kong dollars will be added to the fund. On top of that, we also have other infrastructure like Cyberport and Hong Kong Science Park that is to create not only the office space, but a community of technologies companies so that they can communicate with each other, share ideas with each other, and also each of the institution have their own accelerator and incubation programs to help the technology companies to grow as well. So that is the infrastructure that we have in Hong Kong, and we are very proud to have Mandarin Matrix based in Hong Kong as a very good example. To talk about the market, China is definitely a very big market, but Hong Kong is also in the heart of Asia. So like David would probably like to reach out to the Southeast Asian market and for the students there to learn Mandarin. But I would also like to emphasize another trend that is what we have seen under the COVID. COVID has made a big disruption to the employment market. So in addition to students that the online education program or the EdTech company will provide content to, we're also seeing companies providing online or virtual experience in terms of retooling or rescaling the mature workforce so that they can go back to the employment market during this difficult period or post-COVID period.
Thanks so much, Herman. I want to talk a little bit more about investment, but I'm curious, to hear from some of our founders here today about your experience with investors, because I think that venture capital can be a pretty frothy space, and especially as these kind of new verticals and new models begin to prove themselves, there can definitely be a little bit some irrational exuberance perhaps in some of the private markets. So I'm just curious, maybe you guys can talk a little bit about kind of your experience dealing with investors. Talk a little bit about maybe managing expectations, if you've had to, and kind of what VCs are most interested in when they're talking to you about your company. Will, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, great question, and appreciate a lot of the sentiment that Herman was talking about. I think there's two to three main trends that we've started seeing as we close our next round of funding. The first is we're definitely seeing a lot more mature edtech investment interest from the US into Asia. Prior to COVID, one of the greatest challenges were how do you find mature, experienced edtech VCs, angels, people that have had a track record of growing and building out scalable edtech companies. The education landscape or the edtech landscape in Asia is still evolving. So it was always important for us to look outside, whether it's going to China or to the US. But what we've actually started to see now is a lot more interest in Western VCs show interest in expanding outside of the US, which is helpful for players like us in Singapore, in Hong Kong, in India, in the Indonesias of the world, because it allows us to tap into really smart minds that have the expertise, but can help us really try to arbitrage over the next 12, 18 months. The second is looking at the corporate venture space. You would have read a lot around, your Microsofts, your Amazons, your Googles launching their own education arms. And we see that as a very strategic fit when it comes to using their technology infrastructure, using their network, using their people knowledge. And so what we're also starting to explore now is working really closely with corporate partners interested in building out that education piece. I think the third is just general interest in education. I joke that this is the first time we feel as though, there's wind beneath our wings, because we've been grinding for the past 5-6 years, and education was always the afterthought. But with, what happened with, the Ubers and WeWorks of the world, one of the corrections that we've seen is the focus on strong unit economics. And education is actually one of those businesses where you can, switch on your cash flow positivity, and you can have strong unit economics off the get-go. So, we're seeing a lot more interest from not just the edtech space globally, but agnostics interested in diving more into, the future of work, the future of learning.
Great, thanks so much, Will. And so, Amir, same kind of question to you. You're kind of at the epicenter of a lot of VC activity. So, what's your experience been like?
I think VC appetite for education as a space has really changed dramatically since we started Outschool. We founded Outschool in 2015, and it was, at the time we positioned it as a contrarian bet, because education had been slow to change compared with other industries in the light of technology, and investors had made some investments and frankly been burnt, and so many mainstream venture capitalists did not view edtech and education, at least in the US, as an attractive space. I think one of the approaches we took was to position ourselves as a contrarian investment. The idea that change hasn't happened yet, but it's coming, and we're approaching it with a different model than is tried before. And B, to echo what Will said, we've always been able to generate revenue with strong unit economics, and so always have that as an option, and not necessarily grow through VC funding. We've now raised 2 venture rounds, and our most recent one, there was a marked change in investor appetite in the US for edtech and education. A lot of it driven by COVID. Also, there have been some firms in the US that have become very successful at investing in consumer education. So I think there was this change as investors started to realize, hey, consumer education is very different from edtech that's sold into institutions. And they have very different dynamics. And at least in the US, consumer education has been more promising as an area for investment. And then B, COVID has obviously accelerated adoption. And I think there's a lot of belief now that COVID is going to prove to not just be kind of a one-time event, but it's going to be the catalyst for a lot of change in education that is going to result in a lot more adoption of technology. So going forward, I expect there to be a lot of new investment interest from US-based venture capitalists who aren't necessarily education specialists, but are now recognizing it as a hot space where there is tremendous growth to be had in the next 5 to 10 years.
It's really interesting. I mean, covering the technology space for as long as I have, and kind of going through a lot of the hype cycles and things like that. It's really interesting. It does feel like the rest of the world is kind of catching up with the potential of technology. I mean, we've had the internet for so long already. Part of the problem, obviously, is some of the infrastructure wasn't quite ready for that internet speeds, for example. The fundamental kind of issues with TCP/IP and kind of how do you layer video and audio on top of that. But we're really kind of at that point where we have the technology to make it work. And then we finally kind of also have popular consciousness that, hey, this stuff actually works and it can actually be useful. So it's really exciting, I think. But yeah, anyway, David, so kind of coming back to you, dealing with investors, how have you had to manage expectations? Have you had to kind of like maybe push some inbound back? What are those conversations been like?
Yeah, in many ways, I would echo what Herman said, which is that the ed tech space, and bear in mind my experiences here in Hong Kong, it has in many ways got this bright future when we look at family offices rather than to VCs. And I'm always worried when I hear someone like Amir say there's huge interest from American VCs in ed tech, because I'm not quite sure whether they're the most qualified people to dive into some of these subjects. And there's an underlying reason behind that. And that is because I'm in K-12 education. And the clue's in the K-12. It's a 12-year process to educate a child. And if you have VCs who have far shorter term investment horizons, they might not necessarily be the best fit for you to go and find capital. However, if you're looking, for instance, at Education 4.0, you're looking towards 2030, you're looking at the SDG 4.0 goals, you're actually saying, well, we're already in a 15-year cycle, or in fact, it's an even longer cycle than that, because we go beyond getting to 2030, because that's only when the first batch get there, and then you're going to be at Education 5.0. So to go straight to a VC who is not an expert in ed tech and say, hey, these are great growth figures we've got, we're already EBITDA positive, we've got good strong cash flow, we can get the unitary economics working well, we've got great annuity products, that's fantastic. But they don't understand education necessarily, because they're saying, well, okay, we want to know what the ROI is in 2 years' time, or worse, 3 years. And you're going, well, I'm not going to be able to give you that. You've got to dig in with us here, because this is important. This is not just about money. This is about children. This is about the future of civilization almost. And you can't just have a single channel sort of, it's just about the cash view. You have to have investors who get the bigger picture. And that's why it's a really exciting place for investors to get involved. But maybe that is where you take a place like Hong Kong, which has fantastic family offices, people who have a huge interest in and respect for education. It's part of the local culture. And you reach to those people and say, well, we can really build important businesses here. We can build them like you built the last property wave. You can build them like, you can build these for the future. If you want to name them like you used to name the hospital buildings, you can do that as well. But we can work with you to come up with something which is really powerful, but it isn't necessarily going to have a 3-year IRR or whatever is a target for some venture capitalist who's inevitably very well qualified at venture capital, but might not get the big education picture. So I'm probably being a bit radical there, but I'm 100% with Herman that family offices are important. And I'm even more behind the fact that Hong Kong is perfectly placed to be an ed tech hub. And that's because despite some sort of rumblings, we actually have huge freedoms here to build educational products, which you don't necessarily have in other places in Asia. So I've said my piece there.
Well, that's great. Thank you so much, David. It's really good to hear kind of a different perspective on all that. But I think my time is up. So we're going to move to the Q&A section. So we have a few questions from the audience. So I'll hand the mic back over to Clark.
Thanks, John. Yeah, we do have some questions coming in from the audience here. We've had a couple people ask the question around this theme of AI. So I'll ask the question specifically from Roland Lung. It's good that we see packaged content and live interactions being the center of everyone's attention in EdTech, but what other smart technologies like AI, VR, AR, etc., do you see having a role to play in the next wave of EdTech development? I'll pass that one to Amir to start.
I think that AI and various forms of automation have a big role to play in education to remove load from teachers and to automate certain modes of learning that otherwise would be very kind of labor intensive. I think we're very focused on the live interaction, and I think in the same way as I think the future of education is hybrid in terms of online and in-person learning, I also think it's hybrid in terms of automation versus live interaction. I think, and the reason for that is, whatever we're able to automate away with AI will just cause the demand to shift elsewhere. And so the nature of what we do in class will change. And the core reason for that is that, parents, I don't think want their kids to be, sat in front of a computer all day, every day, learning from a machine. Core to education is the idea that we're learning about human society in various different ways. And if we can automate some parts of that, then parents will want their kids to lean into the live interaction with teachers and their peers in different ways. The social component is really important. So that's why I say there's this balance where, I expect the future of education to be this constant move towards automation and use of AI, in addition to constantly reevaluating how we use the human time in education.
Thanks, Amir. And Will, I'm curious on your side of things with the leadership, management, development side, where you see that heading.
Yeah, I think what's been exciting about the technology piece is you suddenly have a lot more focus from larger players like your Amazon Chimes, your Microsoft Teams, your Zooms, looking closer into the alternative education play. And what that allows you to do is really think less on develop the software and focus more on the pedagogical learnings. Again, I think, I think I echo what Amir and David's working on, which is that hybrid piece around how do you build a learning experience remotely that does almost mimic what it looked like if you were to be learning in person. And so what we've been seeing a lot of a big shift on from the curriculum side is a shift towards non-traditional curricula. So in 2020, what was very big for us was the mental health piece, the remote working piece, and even trickling down from the US, diversity, equity, inclusion. So what I'm incredibly excited about is having more content and curriculum around this new way of working, but also applying it with technology that can support more effective delivery modes. Another piece that is also interesting is if you were to dial back, say 5 years ago, even the latency of internet wouldn't be able to be sufficient to run live calls or live sessions like this on a daily, hourly basis. So it's really looking not just where it is now, but how technology is going to evolve over the next 2, 3, 5 years. And you would essentially have entrepreneurs and edtech players like us really trying to capitalize, mimic, evolve. Clubhouse, for example, has blown up because it's taken on a new, form of communication. So I think you have a lot more creativity in terms of thinking through the live learning experience, but more importantly, the industry itself is shifting in the right direction. So it makes it easier for practitioners and delivery partners like us to operate.
Thanks, Will. And Herman, just on this side of things, when it comes to AR, VR, and ed tech, is that anything that you guys are looking into, or when you're thinking about trying to bring companies into Hong Kong, is that a part of the discussion?
Yes, well, we welcome all kind of technologies company on the education side. But what I can tell to the audience is from the past 12 months, what I have seen is a lot of companies are using AI and even robotics as a deliverer of contents to the students, to the audience.
Right. Okay. Thanks, Herman. I'll move on to another question here that has kind of been touched on, particularly on the hybrid side of things, which might be themed around this. But Angus Tsui asks, what is the remedy on the social factor that has been lost from studying at home? I've found that some of my students feel more lonely or have anxiety as they are extroverts. But because they don't see their friends on a daily basis, they feel restricted or have too much energy they can't spend, especially in a limited space like Hong Kong. I'm curious, I'll go to David here. Is this anything, when you're developing your product or going out to the public with it, is this side of things something that is considered or that is this conversation ever had with parents, for example, and what's the approach on that side of things?
Well, when we designed our online product, we actually did take that into account, and we basically get the learner to go through a little 10-page process, and the average time it should take the learner to go through one unit of learning is about 17 minutes, and that's because we don't want them to be spending their entire time glued to a screen, even if it means that they're going to go and run around their house and terrify their parents because they're locked up. You still don't want them to be stuck there, losing attention and taking the the fun aspects of learning, because a challenge that we have with all of this ed tech is we don't really know how much the learner is actually enjoying it. And if you take that joy out of it, you've kind of missed the point. But I do think that synchronous education, where in effect we have to have the people interacting and being present simultaneously, is going to be vitally important. And I think that's where, whether the teacher is online, but ideally the teacher is face-to-face with a child, is a vitally important part. And that extends not just to the sort of the well-being of the child from the aspects of mental health, but it also extends to the fact that a human teacher is a so much more advanced system at assessing a learner than any AI bot that we can currently come up with, and probably will come up with in the next 10 years. And so the teacher, and I said this right at the beginning, is a vitally important part of this process to allow that learner to continue to feel that they're engaged and engaged in learning and that joy of learning. Because if we lose that, we lose an awful lot. And if that is what ed tech means, we should dial back on it, not forward on it. So I'm very much into this hybrid mode to prevent the sort of problems which the individual asking the question was pointing, which is the disengagement of learners. So let's get to hybrid as soon as possible, because delivery in tech can be strong, but the teaching is still something for teachers to do.
Thanks, David. And Amir, also being in the K-12 space, what are your thoughts on this topic?
We have definitely seen that concern from families during COVID, that their kids feel isolated, and that causes them to have a rough time socially, emotionally. And 100% agree with David on the importance of live interaction with teachers, and not just live interaction online, but in person. And that's why I'm such a big believer in the hybrid model. I will say that in terms of online learning, the growth in the live online format has, during COVID, at least offered some outlets and social interaction, given that people can't be in person, and has benefits in terms of being able to connect kids with teachers and with each other outside their typical local group, which actually can have the benefit of increasing empathy when you're having positive learning experiences with people who don't live in your local area and maybe are coming from different cultures, different locations. So I think there's aspects to the social experience where live online can actually exceed in person. But in terms of just the richness, and the depth of the interaction, then in person is going to remain the gold standard. And because of all these advantages and disadvantages, that's why we ought to be aiming to offering kids a mixed model, and so that we can find the right combination of technologies and interactions that are going to serve the individual learners best.
Thanks, Amir. I'm going to move on to one final question here as we're bumping up on time, and I'm going to gear this one toward Will. Quite an interesting question here. It's around the topic of corporate buy-in. This comes from Maria Lau. Online education is growing dramatically, especially under the pandemic. Classroom training can be justified based on the number of hours staff attend a training class. However, in order to encourage corporate support, how can we evaluate the benefits of employees, taking away from online training?
Yeah, so great point, Marie, and thanks for reaching out. I think the corporate training market has, prior to COVID, has been growing regardless. But one interesting stat is that 60 to 70% of the spend in corporate training has actually been for travel and catering. So instead of sending your top performers to your Hiltons, your Marriotts, now you suddenly have a significantly increased budget on either coaching and training your employees downstream, or diversifying different type of learning formats and learning engagement products. I would actually say that 90% of employers agree now that it's important to have a learning strategy for their organization. In fact, what we're seeing working with SMBs and corporates in the Asia region is they're really trying to integrate this learning while earning concept, where it's allowing employees not to just execute and perform well, but surround them with the right learning ecosystem and the network to continuously grow. in terms of how can we better change that and make that more impactful, what we're starting to see is the shift of the L&D person or the buyer or their persona to become more of a strategic partner in the business. So if you were to dial back, say 10 years ago, head of digital, chief digital officer would be almost a vertical part of a business, but now digital is actually, part of the entire infrastructure of any business that is relevant. And we see that being part of the next 5-10 years. Similarly, in the learning space, where you need to, really start investing, learning, upskilling at all layers of an employee. So one fit that we saw last year was the first-time manager training piece. On average, an employee or professional becomes a manager when they're in their early 30s, but when they receive first-time manager training, it's as late as their early 40s. So you suddenly have this 10-year gap of the blind leading the blind. So what we're very excited about this year is an opening of interest in corporate upskilling with this excess budget, but more importantly, upskilling going downstream into more junior employees. Hope that answers your question.
Thanks so much, Will. And thank you to all of our speakers. Unfortunately, that is all the time that we have. Thank you so much to Amir, Herman, David, and Will for taking the time out to share their thoughts and expertise with our audience. I learned quite a bit. I'm sure our viewers did as well. To our audience, stick around. In about 15 minutes, we have another panel titled Health Tech in the Future of Medicine, where we will be discussing health tech. And before we go, just want to give another thank you to our gold sponsor for this webinar, which is InvestHK. Thank you all again to our viewers for tuning in, and we look forward to welcoming you to the next webinar. Thank you, everyone.